struggling artist painted a mural for free, unaware it would become a city landmark. The words echoed in Elijah's mind as he stared at the blank wall before him, paintbrush trembling in his paint-stained fingers. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he dreamed of his work being recognized, celebrated, remembered? Now he stood here, nearly broke, about to pour his soul into a canvas nobody had commissioned, in an alley few people bothered to walk through. The February wind cut through his thin jacket, but he barely noticed. 3 eviction notices in 6 months, 2 rejected grant applications, a gallery showing that had sold exactly 0 paintings, and now this, his last 5 cans of paint, about to be used on a wall that didn't belong to him, for people who would probably never appreciate it. Elijah closed his eyes, inhaling the sharp scent of the cold air mingling with acrylic paint. The weight of his failure pressed against his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. 32 years old, and what did he have to show for it? A studio apartment he could barely afford, a dwindling bank account, and a dream that seemed to mock him with each passing day. You need a permit for that, you know? The voice startled him. Elijah turned to find an elderly woman watching him from the doorway of the adjacent building, a small, rundown coffee shop with a faded sign that read Ruby's. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, deep lines etched around eyes that held neither judgment nor alarm, just quiet curiosity. Elijah faltered. The truth was, he hadn't even considered permits. The wall had called to him on his walks home, a blank canvas in a forgotten corner of the city. I was just planning to brighten up my wall without asking. There was a hint of amusement in her voice. She stepped closer, arms crossed against the cold. A worn cardigan pulled tight around her thin frame. Your wall? Elijah's stomach dropped. Of course, his one impulsive attempt to create something meaningful, and he was about to become a vandal. Ruby, she said, extending a weathered hand. Ruby Castillo, this place has been mine for 37 years. Elijah shook her hand, noticing the coffee stains on her fingers, the slight tremor that matched his own. Elijah Brooks, I'm sorry about the wall. I can go. Ruby studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering on his frayed jacket sleeves, the shadows beneath his eyes. What were you planning to paint? The question caught him off guard. He'd expected anger, accusations, perhaps even threats to call the police. Not this gentle inquiry that sounded almost like interest. I don't know exactly, he admitted, looking back at the wall. Something about chronarctic connection, finding light in forgotten places. The words sounded ridiculous spoken aloud, the kind of artistic pretension he'd always mocked in others. But Ruby nodded, as if he'd said something profound. This alley used to be the heart of something, you know? Back when the neighborhood was different, people would gather, talk, share stories. Her voice softened with memory. Now they hurry past, eyes on their phones, not even seeing each other. Elijah followed her gaze down the narrow alleyway, trying to imagine it filled with life instead of discarded coffee cups and scattered leaves. For a moment he saw it through her eyes. Not a forgotten space, but a place of lost potential. My business is dying, Ruby said matter-of-factly, no self-pity in her tone. Kids want those fancy chain coffees, not an old woman's brews. Some developer's been trying to buy the building for months. Probably turn it into another soulless apartment complex. Elijah didn't know what to say. His own problems suddenly seemed smaller in comparison to this woman's lifetime of work fading away. Paint it, she said suddenly. What? The wall. Paint it. Whatever you were going to do, Ruby gestured toward his supplies. I can't pay you, barely making rent myself these days. But if you want a canvas, it's yours. Elijah stared at her, searching for the catch. Why would you let a stranger paint your wall? Ruby's laugh was soft, tinged with something that might have been hope. Because what's the worst that could happen? The building gets torn down with ugly walls instead of pretty ones? She turned toward her shop door, then paused. There's coffee inside if you get cold. Real coffee, not that sugary nonsense. Before Elijah could respond, she disappeared inside, the bell above the door jingling softly in her wake. He stood there for several minutes, paintbrush still in hand, staring at the wall that had somehow transformed from an act of desperation to something like permission, something like purpose. With hands steadier than they'd been in months, Elijah opened the first can of paint. Ruby watched through the window as the young man worked. There was something in his concentration that reminded her of Miguel, the careful precision, the way his entire body seemed part of the creative process. 3 decades since Miguel had passed, and still these moments came. Sharp pangs of recognition in the most unexpected places. The shop was empty, as it had been most days lately. A few regulars in the morning, the occasional lost tourist in the afternoon, but nothing like the bustling community hub it had once been. She wiped down the already clean counter, a habit formed over decades, and tried not to think about the property tax bill sitting unopened beside the register. Outside, Elijah had sketched the outline of something on the wall. Shapes that didn't yet reveal their meaning, but moved with a certain rhythm across the brick surface. His movements were sure now, not the hesitant trembling she'd noticed earlier. Creation had steadied him. When the sky began to darken and the temperature dropped further, Ruby filled a thermos with coffee and carried it outside. "You'll freeze out here," she said, holding out the thermos. Elijah turned, surprise registering on his paint-smudged face. He'd been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't noticed the day slipping away. "Thank you," he said, accepting the thermos with grateful hands. The warmth seeped into his cold fingers immediately. "You've been at it for hours," Ruby observed, studying the wall. The sketched outlines were taking form now, figures emerging from shadow, reaching towards something just beyond view. "You should come back tomorrow." Better light. Elijah nodded, suddenly aware of his stiffened muscles, the numbness in his toes. "I will if that's okay. I've barely started." "I'll be here," Ruby said simply. "Been here every day for 37 years. No reason to break the streak now." As Elijah packed up his supplies, Ruby didn't ask what the mural would become. Some things deserved to reveal themselves in their own time. The next morning, Elijah arrived before Ruby unlocked the coffee shop. He hadn't slept well, his mind racing with images and colors, ideas flowing through him for the first time in months. The mural had taken shape in his dreams, clearer, more vivid than anything he'd created recently. His hands had itched to hold a brush again. He was already working when Ruby arrived, the bell above her door chiming at exactly 6:30, as it had for decades. She nodded to him but didn't interrupt, disappearing inside to prepare for the day's meager business. By mid-morning, a few people had paused to watch Elijah work. Not many. This wasn't a high-traffic area, but enough that he occasionally felt eyes on his back. He tried to ignore the self-consciousness that crept up his spine. This wasn't about observers or approval. This was about the wall, the paint, the vision that had woken him at 4 a.m., heart pounding with possibility. Around noon, the door to Ruby's chimed again, and she emerged with a sandwich and another thermos. "Can't paint on an empty stomach," she said, setting both on a milk crate near his supplies. Elijah stepped back from the wall, suddenly aware of the hunger gnawing at him. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager dinner. "You don't have to feed me," he said, even as he reached for the sandwich. "I feed people. It's what I do." Ruby settled onto another crate, her knees cracking slightly as she lowered herself. "Tell me about it," she said, nodding toward the wall. Elijah chewed slowly, considering the emerging mural. Figures were taking shape now. People of different ages, backgrounds, all connected by threads of light that wove between them. At the center, still just an outline, was the coffee shop, rays extending outward into the community. "It's about connection," he said finally. "How places bring people together, create community. How sometimes the most important landmarks in our lives aren't the grand monuments, but the small corners where we find each other." He stopped, embarrassed by the earnestness in his voice. But Ruby was nodding, her eyes fixed on the wall. "Miguel used to say something similar. My husband," she clarified. "He was the people person. I just made the coffee." "Was he an artist?" Elijah asked, noting the way her expression softened at the mention of Miguel. "A storyteller. Different kind of art, I suppose." Ruby smiled faintly. This place was his idea. Somewhere people could share stories, build community. The coffee was just an excuse to get them in the door. As they talked, a young woman with bright blue hair stopped to watch Elijah's progress. She stood at a distance, coffee cup in hand, clearly intrigued but hesitant to approach. Ruby noticed her immediately. "Marisol," she called, "come meet our artist." The young woman approached, her eyes darting between Ruby and Elijah. "Is this a new thing for the shop?" "It's beautiful." "This is Elijah," Ruby said, ignoring the question. "He's bringing some life back to our alley." Marisol smiled at him, genuine interest in her eyes. "It's really incredible. The way the light connects everything. It's like you can feel the energy moving through the neighborhood." Something warm bloomed in Elijah's chest. Not pride exactly, but recognition. Someone saw what he was trying to express. The feeling was so unfamiliar, it took him a moment to identify it. "Hope. Marisol teaches art at the community center," Ruby explained. She's been trying to get me to host a student showcase for months. You should, Elijah said immediately. Art needs spaces to exist. That's what I keep telling her. Marisol's enthusiasm bubbled over. This neighborhood has so many young artists with nowhere to show their work. And Ruby's has the perfect vibe. Authentic, community-focused, not pretentious like the downtown galleries. Ruby waved a dismissive hand. The place is barely hanging on. Who would come? I would, Elijah said quietly. And I'd bring friends. Something shifted in Ruby's expression. A flicker of consideration where before, there had been only resignation. Let me think about it, she said, which was not the flat refusal Marisol clearly expected. As Ruby returned to the shop and Marisol continued on her way, promising to return tomorrow to see the mural's progress, Elijah turned back to the wall with renewed energy. The interaction had crystallized something in his vision. The mural wasn't just about connection in the abstract. It was about this specific place, these specific people, the web of relationships that existed even when we couldn't see them. His brush moved with newfound certainty, adding depth and detail to the figures emerging from the brick. By the fifth day, people were coming specifically to watch Elijah paint. Word had spread through the neighborhood. Something was happening in the alley beside Ruby's coffee. Something worth seeing. Ruby noticed the uptick in business immediately. People who came to watch the mural's progress often stepped inside for coffee or pastries. Not a flood, but more than she'd seen in months. Some were faces she recognized from years ago. Customers who had drifted away to newer establishments, but now returned, drawn by curiosity and perhaps nostalgia. Your artist is good for business, observed Harold, one of her few remaining regulars, as he sipped his daily Americano. Haven't seen the place this busy since the Obama years. Ruby made a non-committal sound, unwilling to acknowledge the flutter of hope in her chest. One good week didn't save a failing business. The developer's latest offer letter sat in her apartment upstairs, still unopened, but ever present in her thoughts. Outside, Elijah had become a local celebrity of sorts. Children stopped on their way home from school to watch him work. Elderly residents from the nearby senior center made the alley part of their daily walk. Even the mail carrier lingered longer than necessary, asking questions about his technique. The mural had evolved beyond Elijah's initial vision. Ruby's coffee shop remained the heart of the image, but around it, the neighborhood had come to life on the brick wall. There were recognizable local figures, Mrs. Patel from the corner grocery, Coach Wilson from the high school, even Harold with his distinctive handlebar mustache. Between them wove ribbons of golden light, connecting each figure to others, creating a tapestry of community. What surprised Elijah most was how the mural had begun to reflect real interactions happening before him. When two neighbors who hadn't spoken in years stopped to admire his work and ended up in conversation, he added their reconnection to the wall. When a group of teenagers helped an elderly man navigate the uneven alley pavement, that moment too found its place in the growing composition. The wall was becoming a living document of the neighborhood's renewal, sparked improbably by a desperate act of creativity. On the seventh day, as Elijah was adding detail to the final section, a well-dressed woman appeared beside him, her attention moving between the mural and a sleek tablet in her hands. "This is unauthorized public art," she said without introduction. Elijah's hand stilled, a familiar anxiety tightening his chest. "I have permission from the building owner." The woman tapped something on her tablet. "I'm Lisa Chen from the city's Public Arts Commission. We've received several calls about this work." Her expression revealed nothing about whether these calls had been complaints or compliments. Before Elijah could respond, Ruby emerged from the coffee shop, arms crossed defensively. "Is there a problem with my wall?" Lisa turned her attention to Ruby. "Miss Castillo, I'm from the city. We need to discuss permits for this installation." "It's not an installation," Ruby countered. "It's my wall and I said he could paint it. Nevertheless, there are procedures." "There are always procedures," Ruby interrupted. "Procedures and permits and fees that make it impossible for small businesses to survive while developers get fast-tracked approvals." The bitterness in her voice spoke of decades of battling bureaucracy. Lisa's professional demeanor faltered slightly. "Actually, I'm here because we want to help." She turned her tablet so they could see the screen. A social media page filled with photos of the mural in progress, comments overflowing with praise and excitement. "This piece is generating significant community engagement. The Arts Commission is interested in designating it as part of our Neighborhood Identity Preservation Initiative." Elijah and Ruby exchanged confused glances. "What does that mean exactly?" Elijah asked cautiously. It means funding for preservation and maintenance. It means recognition as a cultural landmark. And it means protection from development that would destroy it. Lisa's gaze met Ruby's directly on those last words. We're aware of the purchase offers you've received, Miss Castillo. This designation could change the equation considerably. Ruby's expression remained guarded, but Elijah saw the slight tremble in her hands, hope and disbelief battling for dominance. I never asked for a landmark, she said quietly. The best ones rarely do, Lisa replied, her professional tone softening. They emerge organically from community need and response. Like this has, she gestured toward the mural, where several onlookers had gathered to watch the exchange. We'd like to expedite the approval process, if you're amenable. Both the artist and the property owner would receive stipends as part of the program. The word stipend echoed in Elijah's mind. Money for his art, not just any art, but this piece that had poured from him like water breaking through a dam. This work that had come from desperation but transformed into something meaningful. I need to finish it first, he said, turning back to the wall. Lisa nodded. Of course. I'll leave my card. We can discuss details once it's complete. She handed cards to both Ruby and Elijah, then stepped back to join the growing crowd of observers. As Elijah resumed painting, he felt Ruby's presence beside him, steady and contemplative. Did you know? She asked quietly. When you started, did you know this would happen? Elijah shook his head, brush moving in sure strokes across the final section of brick. I just needed to create something that mattered, even if no one ever saw it. Ruby's weathered hand came to rest briefly on his shoulder. People see it, she said simply before returning to her shop where, for the first time in years, a line of customers waited at the counter. The completion of the mural coincided with the first truly warm day of spring. Elijah stood before the finished wall, exhausted and exhilarated, hardly believing the transformation of both the alley and his own circumstances. What had begun as an act of artistic desperation had evolved into something beyond his imagination. The mural now stretched the entire length of the building, vibrant with color and movement. At its heart remained Ruby's coffee shop, rendered in warm golden light that spilled outward to connect the diverse figures of the neighborhood. Young and old, every background represented, their stories intersecting in a visual tapestry of community. In the weeks since Lisa Chen's visit, the alley had become something of a local attraction. Ruby had placed bistro tables outside, where customers now lingered over coffee and conversation. The shop itself had undergone a subtle transformation, still charmingly worn around the edges, but with fresh energy pulsing through it. The arts showcase Marisol had suggested was now scheduled for the following month, with the mural as its backdrop. Local businesses had contributed to expanding it into a proper street festival. Even the mayor had expressed interest in attending the official landmark designation ceremony. As for Elijah, the stipend from the Arts Commission had given him breathing room for the first time in years. More importantly, his phone now rang regularly with commission requests from people who had seen and been moved by the mural. His work was no longer invisible. Are you just going to stare at it all day, or are you coming in for coffee? Ruby's voice pulled him from his reverie. She stood in the doorway of the shop, arms crossed but eyes warm with amusement. Elijah smiled, still finding it strange to be welcomed so easily into a space that had become, improbably, something like home. Just making sure it's really finished. Art is never finished, Ruby said with the confidence of someone who had lived alongside a creator. Miguel used to say that too. You just reach a point where you stop adding to it and let it live in the world. Inside the coffee shop, the afternoon crowd created a pleasant hum of conversation. Elijah recognized many of the faces now. Harold with his Americano, Mrs. Patel discussing community garden plans with the high school science teacher, Marisol showing a group of her students photographs of the mural's progression. Ruby poured him his usual without asking. Dark roast, room for cream, and slid it across the counter. Her movements were more energetic these days. The resignation that had weighted her shoulders when they first met, now replaced by purposeful determination. The developer called again, she said casually, wiping down the already clean counter. Elijah tensed. Despite the pending landmark status, he knew Ruby still owned the building, still had the right to sell if she chose. And a small, satisfied smile curved Ruby's lips. I told him the property wasn't for sale at any price. Then I suggested he invest in the arts festival instead, as a community goodwill gesture. She chuckled softly. Surprisingly, he agreed. Seems he's rethinking his approach to the neighborhood. Relief washed through Elijah. The idea of the mural being destroyed, even for legitimate business reasons, had haunted his thoughts. So Ruby's coffee lives on? With some changes, she acknowledged. Marisol's bringing in student artwork next week. The community center wants to host poetry readings on Thursday evenings. And that baker who was watching you work last week? She's interested in supplying fresh pastries daily. Ruby's expression grew thoughtful. Miguel always said this place was meant to be more than just coffee. Took me 37 years and a desperate artist to finally listen. I wasn't desperate, Elijah protested automatically, then relented under Ruby's knowing gaze. Okay, maybe a little desperate. Desperation and inspiration? Sometimes they're not so different. Ruby nodded toward the window, where the golden afternoon light illuminated the mural beyond. Both push us to create something that wasn't there before. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched people in the alley stop to admire the artwork, take photos, point out details to one another. Every viewer found something different in the mural, a reflection of their own connection to the neighborhood, a face they recognized, a moment they'd witnessed or experienced. I never thought I'd create something that mattered to so many people, Elijah admitted quietly. Most of my life, it's felt like shouting into a void. Ruby's weathered hand covered his briefly. That's the secret about art, about community, about most important things in life. We rarely know the impact we're having while we're having it. We just keep showing up, keep creating, keep pouring coffee. Her smile deepened the lines around her eyes. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to see the connections we've made become visible. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the golden threads that wove through the mural, making them seem to pulse with life, connecting the painted figures just as surely as real relationships now connected the people who gathered in the once-forgotten alley, drawn together by an act of creation that had transformed not just a wall, but an entire community. A struggling artist had painted a mural for free, unaware it would become a city landmark. But perhaps the true landmark wasn't the painting itself, but the web of human connection it had revealed. Connections that had always existed, waiting only for someone desperate enough or inspired enough to make them visible.